welcome to this podcast from the International Society of the Rorschach. I am Marc Desautels. I'm the president of the British Rorschach Society. And today I am meeting with Philip J. Keddy, PhD, who has an independent practice providing assessment and psychotherapy services in the San Francisco East Bay, California. In his assessment practice, he specializes in collaborative therapeutic assessment and pre-employment screening. Dr. Keddy teaches adult assessment in the PsyD program at the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. He led a team with Rita Seiner, Phil Erdberg, and Ariana Schneider-Stocking to prepare a newly translated and annotated 100th anniversary edition of Rorschach's book, Psychodiagnostics. It came out earlier this year, and I have a copy here. Dr. Keddy has a keen interest in the history of the Rorschach and has presented papers on this topic at meetings of the Society for Personality Assessment and the International Society for the Rorschach and Projective Methods. He has contributed past articles to the ISR Bulletin as well. Dr. Keddy has a chapter in the 2017 book using the Rorschach Performance Assessment System that was edited by Meyer and Mihura on using the RPAS in the evaluation of a candidate for a Roman Catholic seminary. He also teaches for RPAS workshops. A case study he co-authored with Dr. Phil Erdberg involving testing before and after electroconvulsive therapy was published in the Journal of Personality Assessment. Dr. Keddy has co-authored other articles on assessment as well. So Philip, good morning to you. Good evening to me. I'm in London, you're in California. So maybe a first question, a general question about the Rorschach. So how did you become interested in the Rorschach?
Yeah, I was first exposed to the Rorschach in my grad school assessment course, like many psychologists, and I was intrigued about it. But I think that I'd already had a previous positive experience of collaborative therapeutic assessment because a counseling psychologist in my hometown in Canada had given me the strong interest inventory when I was in high school and discussed those results with me, and that proved to be helpful. So I think I was interested in open to what assessment could do. I didn't really know anything about the Rorschach at that point. After graduate school, I took a position in a residential treatment center for Catholic clergy and religious, priests, brothers and sisters. Yeah, it was kind of an unusual place where I was asked to coordinate the intake assessment program, as well as doing individual and group psychotherapy. And that was a powerful experience in terms of learning about what personality assessment with the Rorschach and other tests could do, because I would have people that I assessed in individual or group therapy myself, or I would hear about them in staff meetings, maybe 6 or 8 months later in this residential treatment program. And things that had come up in the testing had been apparent in the testing, but maybe not in the person's initial presentation, would suddenly come on to the maybe not suddenly, but would come onto the table over time. And I thought, oh, I see, so it was a powerful experience that way. And also at that time, I was fortunate that Phil Erdberg who's also based in the San Francisco Bay Area, was giving a lot of frequent continuing education workshops on the Rorschach, and sometimes co-teaching with an MMPI expert as well, and these kinds of things. And so I began to consult with him, and that was really what advanced that. I really felt like at that point I began to get a grasp of the Rorschach.
How interesting. Do you still use the Rorschach in your clinical practice today?
Oh yes, yeah. I'm using it, several times a month, I'd say.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is it you find most helpful about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe not an easy one to answer. I was thinking that I think that broadly speaking, the test gives us information about the individual's personality, organization, and functioning. It just really gives us a sense of the individual's world. Tells us how they perceive and organize their world. It's not just about psychopathology. The test provides information about both weaknesses and strengths. And when I first started to work with the test, I was impressed that we can get information from what people see in ink blots that is comparable to information from tests like the MMPI or self-report instruments, and that just was seemed striking to me. Of course, they don't always agree, but then you know sometimes it's giving you some information that the other test didn't get, and it's not that one's right and the other's wrong. It's just different kinds of information, different tools.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, and I think the other thing that in terms of, you know, I kind of fell into the niche of pre-employment screening and screening candidates for the Catholic priesthood, and then doing other work with peace officers here in California, the California Highway Patrol, and so on. But you know, I appreciate that the Rorschach is less vulnerable to impression management than the self-report tests, and that can be helpful in the pre-employment screening or other, you know, forensic situations. But you know, it's also helpful just in collaborative therapeutic assessment, given the extent that we have limitations in our self-awareness. And so, you know,
yeah, absolutely. Yes. Is the test that goes where no other tests go.
Yeah, right. So it's for all those reasons that I found it helpful.
Excellent. And you've got a keen interest in the history of the Rorschach. So how did you become interested in the history?
Yeah, there's sort of different layers to that question, but maybe I'll at least start off by focusing on the aspects of the history that led to the new translation. I mean, you know, I was intrigued to read Ellenberger's The Life and Work of Rorschach. That's often described as a monograph that was published in, I think, the mid-50s. But I became especially interested in the relationship between Rorschach's ideas on introversion and extroversion and Carl Jung's. And I was looking into that, and I began to feel that I could not rely on the 1942 English translation of Psychodiagnostics to do my research. And I needed to look at the original German. And not knowing German, I needed help to do that. I have some ability in French, but that's all. So Phil Lurdberg had encouraged me to visit the Rorschach archives in Bern, Switzerland. And there I was very fortunate to meet Rita Signer a couple of years before she retired from 23 years of overseeing the archives. And of course, Rita's Swiss and knows both German and English. She co-edited a book of Rorschach's correspondence that has yet to be translated. But in answer to my question, she was able to direct me to, you know, this particular letter or to other materials in the archives, and to discuss terminology with me. And she also wanted me to find a local professional translator to do more of the extensive, you know, translating that I was getting involved in with my research. And through the Goethe Institute in San Francisco, I found Ariana Schneider-Stocking, who is a German, English, and Italian conference interpreter, translator, and professor of translation. And so I you know, was writing these papers. I wrote one paper about Rorschach and Jung with regards to introversion and extroversion, and then another one on the relationship between Rorschach's inkblot test and Jung's word association test. And so then the idea of, we had a team that had gelled, and the idea of doing a translation, you know, took off. And so then I went to Hogreffe eventually, Hogreffe is the heir to the original publisher of Rorschach's book, and you know, they hold the rights to the cards and so on now. And so we submitted a proposal to them, which was then accepted. Yeah.
So you were part of a team, or leading a team.
Yeah.
Also, you've already answered some of that question, but was it difficult to track all the documents and everything you needed to do this new translation?
Well, it was partly amazing to see what you can get on the internet, you know, with the laptop from the comfort of your own home these days. You know, that I could find things on Google Scholar, and I have access to the library through the Wright Institute where I teach, and so there was that, and and then Rita's access to the archives and her knowledge of the Rorschach archives. So it was, I think I liked the detective work aspect of it, and it was exciting to be able to find these things and have new questions and new answers, and so on we went.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And the collaboration was really one of the really rewarding parts of it. That I worked with Rita Signer pretty much all via email. We also had a Slack correspondence with the whole team, but it was interesting. Again, that's something that couldn't have been done in Rorschach's time.
Indeed. Now you also partly answered that question, but why did you feel a new translation was needed? And I suppose what does a new translation bring that wasn't there before?
Yeah. Well, let me say for starters on that one that I think it's remarkable that the 1942 translation was done at all, and coming out just before the U.S. entered World War II.
Yeah.
That translation was done by Bernard Cronenberg, MD, and Paul Lemkow, MD. And there's an amusing aspect to the story of it. Cronenberg was an American in medical school in Bern when he did the first draft translation in the 1930s. And he was eager to take the job that the publisher offered to translate the book because he had lost money that his father had sent him for medical school gambling in Monte Carlo. So very, very distinguished history. And so Cronenberg went on to become a prominent ophthalmologist in New York, but he had no interest in psychiatry and never worked with the test. Lemkow, who then reworked it, was a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins, and he had been encouraged to undertake the translation by the Swiss psychiatrist Adolf Meyer, who also played a very prominent part, I guess, in the history of American psychiatry. So that was, the first translation. But just looking at there were actually more revisions or new editions of both the English and the German than I realized. But I had a used edition of Rorschach's book, and it just all seemed a bit neglected to me. And it it is 80 years now since that translation, and I also felt that a book like that needed to be annotated to explain Rorschach's terminology and his sources and influences, and also to make the bridge with, the language that we use in working with the test now.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So, and then, Rita Signer suggested that she add a brief biography of Rorschach. And then she also has a unique and interesting chapter on the creation of psychodiagnostics, looking at earlier manuscripts unpublished manuscripts that Rorschach wrote.
Yeah. Interesting. So how do you think people and the field will benefit from having a reliable and annotated translation of the original book?
Yeah. Well, although the test has been in continuous use for 100 years, there's always been controversy about it, right? And I think that I wanted to see for myself, what Rorschach said, and I hope that we've made it easier for other people who might have that same interest to explore it. And I did a recent search on PsycInfo, the American Psychological Association's database, that covers articles, books, or dissertations that are requested, ones that had Rorschach in the title or in the abstract. And Rorschach has been cited, close to twice a week on average for the past 100 years, which seems really remarkable to me.
That's impressive.
It really is, isn't it? Yeah.
I can't think of any other psychological test who could make that claim.
Yeah, well, Marc Macaulay endorsed our new translation of the book, and I had connected with him because he introduced and edited a collection of Henri Ellenberger's essays after Ellenberger's book on the discovery of the unconscious. So he's really kind of an authority on Henri Ellenberger, and Ellenberger had moved to Montreal late in his life, and that was, Professor Macaulay was on the East Coast of the United States, so he connected with him that way. But anyway, Professor Macaulay in our correspondence said he called Rorschach's book one of the most important standalone books in the history of psychology, which also I thought, wow, like how can you say that? So I asked him, and he said that he's has specialized in the history of psychiatry, and he's taught courses about European intellectual history. And in his view, Rorschach's an important sort of maker of modern thought. That he said he's obviously not as influential as Freud, but one of a group of highly original and influential thinkers about how the human mind works. So it's interesting to hear how a historian places him in that book, but it is from that one book, because that's, Rorschach died prematurely a year after the book came out, and so he could not develop it any further. But all that research that's been done comes from ideas in that book. So
interesting.
Yeah.
I've got maybe a final, slightly tongue-in-cheek question to ask. So
let me say one more thing before you get to that one.
Okay.
So I think the other thing is that Rorschach's ideas continue to inspire new work. I mean, as you know, the Rorschach Performance Assessment System came out in 2011, and just this year, a revision of the comprehensive system has come out as well. So, people continue to be inspired. And then in terms of how, the article or the translation might be used, there is a 2022 article in the special issue of the Rorschachiana Journal by Greg Meyer and the British neuroscientist Carl Friston. And so Professor Friston is at the Wellcome Center for Human Neuroimaging, University College, over there where you are in London. And that issue is on new insights from other disciplines and for Rorschach users. And the article's titled "The Active Bayesian Brain and the Rorschach Test." And Drs. Meyer and Friston looked at how Bayesian active inference can be applied to Rorschach's task. And just to understand Rorschach's views, they say they relied heavily on our new translation, and they described it as an excellent and substantially clearer New English translation. So that's a gratifying example of how the new translation, may be useful for people from other disciplines and not just test users as well. So
making it more accessible.
Right. Hopefully.
Okay. So my slightly tongue-in-cheek question is, as a modern-day Rorschach practitioner, RPAS trained, CS trained, should I read the book?
That's a good question. I would encourage you to read the book. Yes. I mean, I think that the Rorschach's book in the original was not an easy book. And but I hope that we've made it, as you were just saying, more accessible. And Professor Macaulay was asking me, how has your historicized understanding of the Rorschach changed your use of the test, or has it changed your use of the test? I've been thinking about that. I don't know that I have a full answer yet, but I think that it's deepened my understanding of the test to read the original book. And you do see the continuity, and you see that there's been so much misunderstanding about Rorschach. I mean, I think that part of that is that I don't know that Rorschach's commitment to empiricism has always really been appreciated. You see these things like you could get as much from looking at tea leaves or something. Well, actually not. So, in his introduction to the book, he pointed out that he said he was pointing out that the entire work is predominantly empirical, and he didn't have the advantages of research assistants and computers and the internet, but he did collect data, and and a surprising number of the data points that he found have really held up. But I think it's not okay. Some of the variables he identified are not being supported by research,
Yeah.
but I think if we could talk to him today, he would say, well, okay, we have to go with that then. You know, I mean, like that because he was committed to empiricism, and he did regard the idea that I've been learning more that, I mean, he called it an experiment initially, just like Jung called his work with word associations an experiment. It was a time when psychologists were wanting to be scientific, and one way to be scientific was to run experiments. But it was an experiment that he said he discovered accidentally would make a diagnostic test, and that was an empirical finding. Yeah. So I think it will enrich the contemporary Rorschach users, understanding of the test to read it, even if you're not, don't think of yourself as particularly interested in history. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Keddy, it's been very interesting. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for the great questions, and it's great to meet you just over Zoom. I hope to meet you in person sometime.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.